what do we mean by apartheid? First of all, people tend to think of apartheid as what happened in South Africa, and the term comes from there. But there is, in fact, a UN resolution on apartheid that defines what apartheid is. And curiously, all the elements of that are mentioned in that resolution exist also in the West Bank. The most important of which is that you have two populations in the West Bank, Jews and Palestinians. The Jews, the settlers, are extraterritorial Israeli citizens. They live under Israeli law, or some kind of figment that creates them as living under Israeli law. They can vote to the Israeli parliament. They enjoy all the rights of democracy the Jews in Israel enjoy. The Palestinians there live under a completely different set of laws, which give them almost no rights at all. That is, they live under a military regime. They're tried before military courts, where the judges are lawyers on reserve service, Israeli lawyers on reserve service. One can detain them endlessly in prison. And so these are two groups that live under totally different laws. They're also separated from each other by a set of roads, roadblocks, checkposts that make life increasingly difficult for Palestinians and make life much better for the Jewish population there. So from that point of view, there's clearly an apartheid regime in the West Bank, and that has in many ways filtered into Israel. That is, generation after generation of young Israeli men and women are called up and go to serve as policemen in the West Bank in military uniform. Most of what they do is police the population. And that has a corrupting impact on more and more generations of Israelis who get used to the idea that they can break into homes at 4 in the morning, arrest whoever they like. And so that effect is not only that we have an apartheid regime, but we have a corruption of democracy in Israel itself, which ultimately resulted in this attempt by Netanyahu's regime to change the very system of democracy in Israel, which was really only for Jews in the first place.
And Professor, I'm wondering if you mentioned previously the acquiescence or the refusal to confront the problem in general in Israeli society of the occupation. Why do you think that is, especially given the fact that Israel in its early years had a very vibrant labor, socialist, and humanitarian movement among those who created the State of Israel? What has happened?
Well, I would say, I mean, the simple answer is that power corrupts, and that Israel has suffered for years from a kind of euphoria of power. And when I talked about the sort of link between what happened in 1973 and what happened in 2023, it is exactly that. That is that Israel came to believe that it's strong enough to be able to do what it likes, and it does not need to have any political compromise, which means territorial compromise. The war of 1973 could have been avoided had Israel agreed to negotiate with Anwar Sadat, at the time the president of Egypt, which it did eventually after the war, and returned the Sinai Peninsula and received peace in return. But 3,000 Israeli soldiers were killed, some of whom were my classmates. And the same happened now. That is, Israel refused to talk about any territorial compromise and believed that Hamas can lob a few rockets here and there, but by and large, it's not a problem for it. And therefore, there's no need to think of any territorial compromise. And this became the sense in the large sectors of the Israeli public. People could live in Tel Aviv, have a good time, have a good life, and 20 miles to their east, there was an apartheid regime, but it really had very little to do with them. And the curious thing was, and this is what we were trying to point out in August, was that the people who were protesting, the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who quite remarkably went out to the streets every Saturday to protest against the erosion of democracy in Israel, refused to talk about the occupation. And when I was there protesting against that, we were marginalized. We were pushed to the side, and people said, well, occupation, that's a difficult term. You know, not everybody agrees on that. Let's not talk about it now. It'll divert attention. Whereas in fact, it was the core of the very attempt to change the rules of the game in Israel.